afraid, pray. Keep your eyes focused on what's supposed to be right, and that is right in God's word. Pray for this president. Pray for this nation. For God still is in control. He is putting America through something that America has asked for. It put away all of its moral and righteous thinking for the big riches, the big billionaire who's supposed to have all the money and how to make money. And they seem to think that money is the answer. Where is right and where is wrong? Where is morality and where is immorality? And it goes back to your own personal life of your choice. Stay with us today as we talk about the awakening of the real right in America. The awakening of the real right in America.
It feels like America is more divided than it's been in decades. Getting along with those who disagree on politics has become difficult, tearing families and communities apart. It seems like now, politics isn't just about what you think, but who you are. It's personal. We've seen this feeling cause growing extremism on both ends of the political spectrum. The events in Charlottesville, Virginia, showed the ability of white nationalists to assemble off the internet and into the real world. Earlier that same summer, left-wing extremists essentially shut down Evergreen State College because a white professor dared show up on a day white people were asked to be absent from campus. And it seems like left-wing and right-wing extremists are just getting the other side even more riled up. There's a name for this problem, and it's called identity politics. Identity politics is the tendency for people of a particular race, religion, gender, or ethnicity to organize politically around that special interest for the sole purpose of advancing that interest without concern or regard for any larger group or collective. You might ask, what's so bad about identity politics? You wouldn't care about identity politics if it was your identity group being discriminated against. This is a misunderstanding of what identity politics is. There is a time for identities to come together when they are being discriminated against as a class, but the goal of these movements are only ethical when they seek to remove the political impact of identity, not enforce it. The civil rights movement is a great example. The civil rights movement was not identity politics. It was about destroying identity politics, creating a society where we'd see people as individuals rather than members of groups. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr.,
says, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
That's not in line with the recent push on the left to create black-only dorms at colleges, or women-only film screenings, or spaces without white people. Nor is it in line with those on the right who believe America should be a Christian-only nation, or want to mandate gender roles, and obviously not those who want a white ethno-state. Let's treat other identities as we would have them treat ours. There is beauty in different people with different ideas and of different backgrounds coming together to form America. But when it comes to politics and policy, let's treat people as people, recognizing and celebrating their unique characteristics as individuals instead of reducing them into an identity group. I'm Joseph Klein. Thanks for watching.
How do you use fiction to comment on reality when reality currently seems so fantastic?
Yeah, well, it's a question I think many of us have been asking ourselves. I mean, I had dinner with Ian McEwan a few nights ago, and we were agreeing that if we had written down what has really happened in the world and offered it to our publishers as a novel, the publisher would have turned it down for being too unbelievable. So the truth is stranger than fiction line has never been more true. And I think what happens is that writers can perhaps in a way be the truth tellers in a moment when there's so much fakery around.
Well, you mentioned truth in your answer, and, the subject of truth is so central to this moment. Do you still have faith in an objective, verifiable truth?
Well, I think, there's always been an argument about the truth, that truth is different for different people. That's always been the case. There's a degree of subjectivity, but there are things that are objective. There are things that are so and other things that are not so. And I think when we're talking about the very large scale of what's happening in a society, it's very important, I think, that people in a society have some broad agreement about the nature of reality. Otherwise, it's a very dangerous thing. You
do capture in The Golden House this sort of topsy-turvy reality that we're living. You have this character called the Joker who runs for the US president. You write that suddenly lying was funny and hatred was funny and bigotry was funny. And, they're things that we previously didn't find even remotely amusing.
Yeah, I mean, it's become very black, the comedy in America now. And there's a line in the novel where one of the characters says that it's as if DC, that's to say comics, has taken over DC, that's to say Washington. And as if we're in the business of being ruled by grotesques and cartoons. And that's why the words Donald Trump don't occur in the novel, but there is this Trump-esque version of Batman's archenemy instead.
I sometimes wonder if ridicule is used enough as a weapon, because a lot of what we see in politics is genuinely ridiculous, and nothing inflames people with gigantic egos more than being ridiculed.
Well, I agree with that, and I think actually one of the things that I admire right now in America is the way in which comedians are doing that, the way in which Saturday Night Live and John Oliver and Bill Maher and Stephen Colbert and Samantha Bee, all these figures are using comedy as a way of getting and actually making quite serious political points, but also getting under the skin of a notoriously thin-skinned president.
Next year is the 30th anniversary of the publication of the Satanic Verses, and yet here we are all these years later, and the politics of offence and Islamist extremism are once again front and centre. How do you think things are different now, though?
Well, what's happened in the last 30 years is the rise of a whole wave of terror attacks, which weren't happening in the same way 30 years ago, and we have to combat those. But I also, I just think one has to hold on to one's principles, and one has to hold on to the idea that we have the right to talk about whatever we like and criticize, as you were saying, satirize any form of power, whether secular or theocratic. And we just have to push on. You personally have had to endure huge sacrifices in the name of that belief. How does it make you feel in this day and age to therefore see American colleges hound out people with politically incorrect viewpoints, or this advocacy of so-called trigger warnings? Yeah, I mean, I've spoken out against all that stuff. I think it's pretty absurd. I think universities are safe spaces for thought, not safe spaces from thought, and I also think that it is somewhat exaggerated, the amount of this stuff that's going on, because I teach at New York University, NYU, and before that I taught in Atlanta at Emory University, and I go around America lecturing at quite a lot of colleges, and I have literally never encountered a single student who has talked in this way, who has demanded safe spaces or trigger warnings, or who wants to deplatform people, or etc. So I know there is some of it going on, but there's also an enormous amount of the American Academy where it doesn't go on, and where actually my students, when these subjects are brought up, are quite contemptuous of that kind of point of view. So I think let's not overstate what's going on. What do you think about this idea that a person's identity is central to the credibility of their argument? What is interesting to me about the subject of identity is first of all, that it is so vividly alive in people's minds right now. And secondly, that it doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. So in India, for example, which is where the Goldens come from originally, the subject is really about religious identity. When you talk about identity, you're talking about Hindu-Muslim issues. In America, you're really talking more about race and gender issues. And right at this moment, you're talking about actually what is it to be an American in the age of Trump? What is what is America? What is the America that he wants to make great again? And what I worry about is that in all of this, and the novel goes into this somewhat, is that we're being asked to narrow our identities, to define our identities more and more narrowly as of one thing, this and not that. Whereas actually anybody who reads novels, anybody who loves novels knows that human beings aren't like that, that human identity is actually very multiple and complicated and even contradictory, and that's what makes us rich characters. That's what makes us interesting as human beings, that we are many things, not one.
You speak of people who love novels. I think it's fair to say your most loved novel is Midnight's Children. How does it make you feel to know that now it's being read by people who weren't even alive when you wrote it?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the point of doing this kind of thing, I think, because I think if you're my sort of writer, what you hope to do is to write books that will endure and that will, if you're lucky, outlast you. So, I mean, I think the fact that Midnight's Children, which is whatever it is, 36 years old, is still, has some meaning and interest for young people who weren't, as you say, weren't alive when I wrote it. I mean, that feels like the biggest prize of all, and the one or two of the other books, which are as old as that, or almost as old as that, are beginning to have the same experience. I mean, the Satanic Verses, which, as you said, is coming up for 30, is finally allowed to have the ordinary life of a novel, and people can read it as a novel and discover that a lot of people read it and discover that it's funny. One of the things that nobody ever said about that book at the time is that it was funny, because what happened to it wasn't funny. And now people are discovering that it's actually in many ways quite a comic novel. So, I mean, I love it that my books go on being interesting. It would be very sad if they were just to disappear and be forgotten.
Well, great pleasure to speak to you about your new novel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Last year, as American liberals struggled to make sense of the Donald Trump phenomenon, historian Mark Lilla offered his analysis in the pages of the New York Times. His essay took his fellow liberals to task for what he called the, quote, moral panic of identity politics, arguing that brand of politics had cost the Democrats the election and liberalism so much more. It was provocative and is now the stepping-off point for his latest book that's called The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics. Mark Lilla is professor of humanities at Columbia University and joins us now on the line from New York, New York. Mark, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
Good to be here, Steve.
Excellent. Let's just start with a basic definition. How are you defining identity liberalism?
Well, there are really two periods of identity politics on the liberal side ever since the 1950s. There was one brand of identity politics that was about incorporating groups, African Americans, women, gays, into the great American democratic we, saying that we're citizens just like you and we deserve to be treated equally. Then in the 70s and 80s, there was a shift to a second kind of identity politics, which was more personal and about myself and my own very complex identity, and also a politics of difference. So rather than it being about bringing us together into a, as I said, great democratic we, instead doubts were raised about the existence of it, and politics came to be conceived of on our liberal side as a politics of groups, of movements, and not party politics with a message that would offer a vision of American destiny that would attract Americans from all walks of life.
And why do you think it became so negative that it cost, in part, Hillary Clinton the election?
Well, many things go into a presidential election loss, and of course she won the popular vote. But the election of Trump is the culmination, really, of 30 to 40 years of a failed political strategy. During the Reagan years, when Reagan essentially delegitimized the use of government to meet social problems, it was a time for liberals to offer a new liberal vision of what makes us about our rights, but also our duties and our obligations to each other. and to offer a political vision as opposed to Reagan's anti-political division. Instead, this second kind of identity politics grew up. And for that and many other reasons, the people began drifting away from the Democratic Party. And for example, and that has nothing to do with President